This week, we thought we might be able to begin to live stream our services from the sanctuary for the first time since the end of March. And in anticipation, I had the beginning of my Friday evening Dvar Torah planned based around the opening 2 words of our Torah portion, Ki Tetzei, when you go out. Admittedly, the parashah is addressed to an Israelite warrior and goes on to deal with the law regarding taking captive a woman as prisoner of war and the soldier's permitted marriage to her once she has spent a month lamenting the loss of her parents. But that aside, the phrase Ki Tetzei might have led nicely into some reflection about how Rabbi Igor and I can at last sally forth from our homes to lead the services from the sanctuary of the LJS. Unfortunately, our preparations are taking a little longer than anticipated. And so, without the pretext of that opening verse from the parashah, I'm going to turn to an equally risky reading, our Haftarah for tomorrow morning, the 5th of the 7 Haftarot of consolation that are read between Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah. For most of the liturgical year, the Haftarot are connected thematically with the Torah reading, and they provide rich interpretative filters for the Pentateuchal passages. In other words, it appears that the choice of Haftarot were as much about what the rabbis wanted to communicate to their congregations in their own time as they were about the context of the scriptural passages and the time in which they were written. During the weeks between Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah, however, the Haftarot are not connected with the parashah at all, but are part of a larger sequence of prophetic readings recited in the 3 weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av, and then extending over a further 7 weeks with readings of consolation taken from specific chapters in Deutero-Isaiah, from chapter 40 up to chapter 63. There isn't time to look at the individual readings of these 7 Haftarot, but suffice to say that they seem to have been judiciously chosen, because their opening verses form a dialogue between God and Israel. God seeking to comfort Israel, who has been sent into exile. Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God, in the first Haftarah. And Israel in the second, lamenting God's abandonment of her. The Eternal One has forsaken me. My Sovereign has forgotten me. And so the dialogue continues from week to week, God urging consolation upon the people, Israel remaining disconsolate, until the 7th and final Haftarah, just before Rosh Hashanah, when Israel capitulates and accepts the redemptive message offered by God. Sos asis Adonai, I will greatly rejoice in the Eternal One. My whole being exults in my God. And it struck me as I was sort of reading the opening verses of these Haftarot, one after the other, that in many ways they were like an extended movement from a symphony or a string quartet. We hear the different voices striving with each other, dissonant, conversing, until there is a resolution, until there's a sense of unity and direction. If the 5th Haftarah from Isaiah 54, which we read tomorrow, is intended to give comfort, then equally it presents considerable difficulties for the contemporary reader. And I must admit that when it has been read in synagogue, I've often received critical comments afterwards. Why can't you read something else? It is offensive and hurtful. It is inappropriate for modern sensibilities. Its 10 verses are addressed to Israel in exile, a nation barred from its land. And at the very beginning, Israel is compared to an akara lo yalda, a barren woman who has never given birth. We can see immediately why the imagery of Israel cast into exile by God like a forsaken wife is theologically problematic. However powerful the all-embracing dialogue between God and Israel may be, there is still a strong judgmental aspect to this Haftarah. The barren woman is a punished woman who has been forsaken by her husband, God, because of her sins. And this binary imagery of God as husband and Israel as wife is challenging for us. However triumphantly God portrays the future for Israel, her return to Zion, settled cities, dispersion throughout the land, how do we address the issue of God as husband, bo'alayich, who freely abandons his wife in a moment of anger, but can take her back again, berachamim gadolim, with abiding love or great compassion? Where is Israel's agency if she is merely the object of God's capricious whims? And where is our agency if we portray ourselves as abandoned and forsaken, the weakest members of society? This Haftarah, like its 6 companions, was intended to bring a message of consolation and hope, of redemption in an age later than Deutero-Isaiah, after the destruction of the temple by the Romans. It draws on imagery that is used throughout prophetic literature in Hosea, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and also in Lamentations. Its message is one of reconciliation and love, national reconciliation, but for us, individual return and acknowledgement of God's abiding love and mercy for us. In biblical literature, the widow or abandoned woman was a woman without identity, socially disadvantaged, vulnerable, and in need of protection, which might explain the imagery of these verses. Continuing to use these prophetic readings during these 7 weeks requires us to probe more deeply beyond these time-bound metaphors in order to wrest something theologically meaningful for us in today's world. And so one way to read the Hebrew of the opening verse is not to translate akara as barren, but rather as uprooted from the same Hebrew 3-letter root, ayin kuf resh. And so we might read that opening verse in this way: let the one who has been uprooted from their homeland sing. And to read the following phrase qualifying the akara, the one who has never given birth, as the one who is separated from their moledet, their family, their kindred. Then we begin to see this passage not about the gendered role of men and women in biblical times, but as a universal message to people who have been uprooted, displaced, trafficked, who have escaped torture and persecution, famine or flood, who do not know when or if they will see their families again. This Haftarah then becomes a passage about conquering fear and feelings of abandonment, about finding a home and identity, and about finding love and trust. It is not too far-fetched to degender and desexualize this passage and retain it in our lectionary, so that when we hear its poetry and words of redemptive hope, we ensure that what we internalize is not a message of power and disempowerment, but rather, as the closing verses testify, a message of love and peace. Though the mountains may depart and the hills be removed, my love shall never depart from you, and my covenant of peace shall not be removed, says the one who loves you, the Eternal One. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will, and let us say, Amen.